Well, we're going to start, although one of our speakers is delayed, and there are some, I think, traffic issues for some other people, but I know what it's like to wait for 15 minutes. So if you don't mind, I'll just talk for about an hour while we're waiting for people to come. I'm not used to not getting a chance to talk. My name is John Esposito. I was the founder, well, yeah, I was, right. I'm the founding director of the Al-Walid Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and currently the director of our Islamophobia project called The Bridge: Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia. I did an announcement recently in which I said the bridge, ending pluralism, and had to retreat. I'm delighted to be here. My wife and I had to take 2 planes to get here, but we arrived, and our Italian lasagna did, which is homemade, and that means that we will definitely end on time. We will not run very late, okay? So we proceed from what's best for me. All right. This program occurs in an interesting context. If you look at recent studies, as well as polling data, you now see statements that talk about the fact that Islamophobia has grown exponentially in 2015. In fact, that it's at pretty much its highest point if you look at the US and Europe. And at the same time, major studies, particularly studies by Media Tenor, T-E-N-O-R, and you can look up their stuff on the website, but I would suggest that you just go to bridge.georgetown.edu, and we have a lot of that information there. But Media Tenor has come out with a study, and it's done a number of studies, monitoring major media in Europe and America. At one point in one of its studies, it did a 10-year study of 975,000 pieces of media out of Europe and America. Its latest study shows that the negativity has hit an all-time high. What does that mean? Looking at media in the US, UK, and Germany, it found that 9 out of 10 stories were negative, i.e. focused primarily on terrorism, warlords, with very little coverage of the broader context, the mainstream communities of Muslims around the world, mainstream Islam, etc. And that even the so-called coverage of the mainstream, more than 50%, tended to be on the negative side. So we have that broader context. Then we have, of course, the presidential primaries, and I'm not going to get into that because we have speakers who will deal with it. But these presidential primaries, like the presidential primaries of 2008 and 2012, like the congressional elections in 2010 and beyond, at these times with these elections, and particularly the presidential, you see a real surfacing of anti-Muslim rhetoric from candidates. And one can go through a list over the recent years of a Newt Gingrich, a Michelle Bachmann, Rick Santorum, and Herman Cain, and you can move into the current lot, particularly Trump and the rest whose names I will choose to block out. Now, it occurs within a context that is influenced by a number of issues. Domestic and international terrorist attacks by AQ and ISIL obviously are important. Mass and social media and its coverage. American presidential elections and politics. But these are catalysts for Islamophobia, and the problem with that is that often it hypes a fear that is so exaggerated that that which a fraction of a very deadly group of and dangerous group of people brushstrokes both the religion of Islam and the vast majority of Muslims. The net effect of that is often that it then impacts domestic policies within the US and Europe, many of them touching on issues of civil liberties, as well as foreign policies. With regard to the social media side of things, if you follow the Bridge Initiative on Twitter and you tweet us at our handle, I'm terrible at this stuff. Somebody else tweets for me, so I may say this wrong. Well, Bridge INIT, is that the way I should put it? Or hash Bridge INIT?
It's right up there.
Oh, it is? Okay. Well, you can read. Good. All right, so that's that. All right, so let's begin with the program. Now, our first speaker, Noreen Shaw, is running late, so we'll begin with Enji Abdulkader. Enji Abdulkader is an attorney, scholar, and adjunct professor here at Georgetown, whose portfolio enables her to examine diverse manifestations of Islamophobia through an interdisciplinary lens. She's also a legal fellow with the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, whose writings, by the way, were identified and celebrated on World Women's Day by ISPU. They singled out her work to honor it. Excuse me. And also works with the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice Committee on Religious Freedom. Is an advisor to the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, U.S. State Department's Religion and Foreign Policy Group. Angie has a JD from Rutgers and an LLM from the University of Pennsylvania Law School. I never told you this, but up until 3 weeks ago, I've been telling everybody that your LLM was from Georgetown. So it's okay, but I think Penn's an okay school. Okay, Angie, it's your chance.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Esposito, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I also want to take a moment to thank my colleagues and staff at the Bridge Initiative. As many of you are aware, the Bridge Initiative is a new research project at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. We are devoted to exploring various manifestations of Islamophobia, both here in the United States, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. The unsung heroes who are not with us on the stage today include Kristen Shakurji, who's taking photographs, together with her colleague Kevin Prine, both of whom are our program coordinators and who were largely responsible for the logistics of today's program. Without them, you wouldn't have the chairs that you're sitting on. So thank you to both Kristen and Kevin. I also want to thank Jordan Denary as well as Nazir Harb, who are live tweeting this program, so that way we could actually disseminate the message and information that's being shared with all of you here in this room with everybody else in the outside world. I also want to recognize the efforts of our Director of Research, Nathan Lean, who is here as well, and of course our fearless leader, Dr. John Esposito, who's made all of this possible. My remarks will specifically highlight trends and patterns of Islamophobia during this presidential election season in a broader context of violence and hostility confronting American Muslims as a minority faith group in this country. One moment. So we begin on March 23rd of last year, 2015, and that's the day that the first individual, Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, actually declared his candidacy for high office. At that time, approximately 1 month before his doing so, we saw the murder of 3 American Muslim youth in North Carolina. You may recall their tragic story. These are Dia, Yusar, and Razan. They were actually gunned down in their homes by a neighbor and shot execution style with 1 bullet in each of their heads and killed instantly. When law enforcement officials investigated their deaths, they cited a long-standing parking dispute as the likely motive, but the parents and family members, friends of these 3 victims said that it was more likely a hate crime. And specifically, they cited the fact that they had expressed their fears before they were murdered. And specifically, one of them had told her father that she sensed that the attacker actually didn't like them, hated them just because of who they are. It's important to note that as we've cited previously on our website and in our research that Dia, Yusar's, and Razan's deaths didn't happen in isolation. In fact, our project examined a specific time period of 6 months from November 2014 to July 2015, and found that there were actually 52 other incidents involving violence, Muslims, and Muslim organizations here in the United States. And this is an infographic which highlights what those 52 incidents consist of. And if you think it's cool, we actually have a lot more infographics on our website, which Dr. Esposito was kind enough to provide you with. So as you can see here, this includes 8 murders of American Muslims, 6 physical assaults, 10 threats to mosques, 7 acts of vandalism involving mosques, as well as 11 acts of vandalism against Muslim homes. Now, interestingly, late last year, there was media attention given to the fact that mosques were disproportionately targeted by individuals for anti-Muslim attacks. What hasn't gotten as much traction is this trend involving Muslim homes. If you look according to this infographic and to the period that we actually looked at, there were more Muslim homes targeted by acts of vandalism than there were mosques. So whereas mosques are actually very symbolic of a community, specifically the Muslim community, and therefore attacks against mosques are really meant as acts of intimidation and violence against the community as a whole, sending a larger message that the community is not welcome there. Attacks against Muslim homes, particularly in a country that values property rights the way that we do, is arguably that much more traumatic. So this is meant to actually highlight the broader context of violence and hostility confronting American Muslims at the time the inauguration of the 2016 presidential cycle. Notably, these statistics, these numbers, don't reflect the number of bias-based bullying incidents confronting American Muslim youth in schools. They don't reflect instances of employment discrimination that are occurring throughout the country, both in terms of barriers to securing employment as well as harassment and intimidation once an American Muslim secures a position and is on a job. It also doesn't reflect acts of public accommodation discrimination. So for instance, when Muslims experience discrimination at a bank or at a credit union or at a restaurant or at an amusement park with their family or the grocery store. But it does give us insight into the religious freedom landscape involving American Muslims today. And oftentimes, when we think of religious freedom, we think of state interference with the right to practice one's religious beliefs or to believe in the first instance. We think of official restrictions, laws, policies that prevent us from realizing our First Amendment rights. But another important and equally significant aspect of religious freedom is that of social hostilities. And when I say social hostilities, I'm referring to acts of religious hostility by individuals, organizations, and social groups that may also interfere with the right to practice and believe freely. It may have a chilling effect on an individual's desire to go to the mosque if the mosque is subject to arson or is receiving bomb threats or is consistently vandalized. It may have a chilling effect for a young woman to wear the hijab if she's afraid she's going to be spat at when she walks down the street. If she's afraid she's going to be run off the road when she's driving her car. If she's afraid she's going to be physically assaulted when she is speaking with her family while sitting and eating dinner at an Applebee's restaurant. Now, I've explained the religious freedom landscape, but the truth is that after Senator Ted Cruz declared his candidacy in March of 2015, the political rhetoric, particularly surrounding Muslims, was pretty tame, as reflected in this image, which seems somewhat surreal, knowing all that we know now. As you can see, this is an image of Republican frontrunner Donald Trump posing with two women who are identifiably so because of their religious garb. And this picture was taken in April of last year at a Muslim Capital Day in Iowa that was organized by the Council on American Islamic Relations. And these women are with the Council on Islamic Relations. Little did we know everything that was to come. Donald Trump would actually declare his candidacy in June of 2015. So what was happening around then? If we look at the month of July, immediately after Mr. Trump declared his intention to run for high office, there were actually 12 incidents involving violence or promoting violence against Muslims or Muslim organizations. 12 does not seem like a very large number. But here's a different way of looking at it. This is a calendar view of 12 incidents of violence during the month of July. On July 1st in New Jersey, a South Asian man was found on the side of the road bleeding from the head after a bias attack. He was the latest in a series of victims of South Asian men who had been targeted in a similar manner. On July 2nd, also in New Jersey, the Islamic Center of Passaic County received what was called a swatting hoax. Essentially, someone called the police and said that they saw an armed gunman inside the mosque. The police showed up, evacuated the mosque, conducted a thorough search, and left with nothing. On July 4th, in Washington State, the exterior of a Bosnian Heritage Association was vandalized with the words, "Death to Islam." Muslims frequently worship there. On July 5th, in California, a Muslim-owned business was set ablaze. The owners later found a Molotov cocktail at the site. On July 6th, in Pennsylvania, a bar owner hung the sign, "Death to Islam," similar to the vandalism in Washington State at that Bosnian Heritage Association building. It actually increased business. On July 11th, in New York, a 19-year-old Muslim woman who was wearing Islamic garb was physically assaulted and her jaw fractured. She was taken to the hospital and underwent surgery. She was speaking Urdu at the time of the assault. On July 13th, a mosque in Virginia was vandalized while people were praying inside. On July 15th, in Texas, the Islamic Association of Collin County was threatened with the desecration of a proposed Muslim cemetery with pig heads and pig's blood. On July 16th, there was a mass shooting by a mentally unstable man who self-identified as Muslim in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He had a long history of depression and drug abuse. On July 17th, that same mosque in Virginia was vandalized for a second time in a 1-week period. On July 20th, in Illinois, the window of an Islamic center was shattered while people were praying inside. On July 25th, in Virginia, the glass in Masjid an-Nur Islamic Center's front doors was shattered, and while people walked outside of the mosque, their neighbors called them terrorists. On July 25th, in Tennessee, the Muslim Community Center of Northeast Tennessee received a call that the mosque would be burnt down. So 12 doesn't seem like a lot. But if you're a mother walking by a bar with a sign that says "Death to Islam," that's probably one too many. If you're that 19-year-old woman who was physically attacked in New York and underwent surgery, 12 is one too many. And if you're a child whose mosque was vandalized with the words "Death to Islam," that's probably one too many. Now, interestingly, July did include an instance of domestic terrorism involving that mentally unstable Muslim. But most of the attacks that are on this calendar occurred before that incident. And even after that incident, there actually wasn't much of a violent backlash against the Muslim community. And there could be several reasons for that. First, the incident occurred on a holy holiday. And the response of the local Muslim community in Chattanooga, Texas, was to actually cancel their holiday celebrations. To put this in perspective, it would be akin to canceling celebrating Hanukkah or Easter or Christmas. But the Muslims in Chattanooga, Texas did this because they joined their neighbors and their friends and their coworkers in mourning the loss of those who were murdered. Secondly, President Obama also made a public statement in response to the mass shooting. And he characterized the perpetrator as a quote-unquote lone gunman, not connected with any other Muslims or network of criminals. And so this was important to sort of put the incident into context. Conversely, so it speaks to the significance that leaders play and that their statements make. Conversely, President Obama was also criticized by Republican presidential hopeful Ted Cruz, who stated on the 17th of July that there is no such thing as a lone gunman, and that the Chattanooga shootings were actually an act of quote-unquote jihad, which is an Islamic doctrine that's commonly misconstrued and misused, although it really denotes a struggle, and usually a moral or spiritual struggle for the vast majority of Muslims here and around the world. Now, interestingly, in terms of Islamophobic political rhetoric, the first GOP debate was in August, and while we did see a little bit of Islamophobia at that time, specifically with Governor Pataki and Senator Graham talking about how they're going to surveil mosques and shut down religious houses of worship in their bid to counter terrorism, the full wave of Islamophobia didn't actually hit until September. On September 15th, specifically, we had Rick Santorum, who said on an interview in a Mike Gallagher show, there are serious questions about Islam and the spread of Islam and how it spreads, quote unquote. And so here we see someone who's aspiring for high office problematizing a religion as opposed to identifying the problem as a religious extremist within a faith, which actually exists in all faiths. On September 16th, during the CNN Republican debates, Senator Lindsey Graham said, Kim Davis, I'm not worried about her attacking me. I'm worried about radical Islamic terrorists who are already here planning another 9/11. We're at war, folks. I'm not fighting a crime. Young men from the Middle East are different than Kim Davis, and we've got to understand that. So here we see Senator Graham brushstroking the Muslim males from another part of the world, right, in the Middle East, when in fact, according to research data from Pew, Zogby, and the Doha Institute, the vast majority of individuals, men and women, in Muslim-majority countries, from Indonesia to Malaysia, from the United Arab Emirates to Egypt and Lebanon, reject ISIS ideology as a perversion of Islam. So his statements aren't actually a reflection of the reality. On September 18th, Donald Trump, who we see here, was at a town hall meeting in Rochester, New Hampshire, when a supporter, now infamously asked, "We have a problem in this country. It's called Muslims. Our current president is one. We have training camps growing where they want to kill us. When can we get rid of them?" And Trump responded, "We're going to be looking at that." So of course here we see that Muslims once again are problematized, and there's many different layers of Islamophobia. The viewpoints of this supporter are actually reflective of some of the findings that we made in our super survey, and if you haven't obtained a copy, they are outside on a table. They're also available online on our website. Essentially, it's a compilation of American views towards Muslims and Islam spanning 2 decades. And one of the findings that is shared there is that 1 in 5 Americans have negative views of Muslims. It also shares that Americans feel colder to Muslims than any other faith group in the United States. So we see that represented in that question. And because Muslims are problematized, it makes it more palatable to single them out for discriminatory treatment. And again, the super survey finds that the polling data supports this. More than 25% of Americans believe that it's okay to religiously profile Muslims. More than 25% of Americans believe that it's okay to monitor Muslims, that it's okay to require special IDs for Muslims, and that internment is okay as well. We also see in that question the false rumor and belief common in the GOP that our current president is actually a Muslim, as if there's anything wrong with that. And finally, there's the ambiguity of the question that was posed. Quote unquote, when can we get rid of them? Are they talking about mass expulsions? Or are they referring to something more violent? So September 20th, September 27th, and 28th, Ben Carson enters the picture. And here you see his campaign slogan, heal, inspire, revive. But some might say that you should also include recover, because a number of people are still recovering from the Islamophobia that Ben Carson unleashed on the United States of America back in September. So on September 20th, he appears on NBC's Meet the Press, and he says a Muslim should not be in charge of the country. On September 27th, he appears on CNN's State of the Union and says that a Muslim who wants to run for president needs to reject all tenets of the Islamic faith. On September 28th, he's on ABC's This Week, and he says or suggests that it is okay to search Syrian refugees because they are Muslims. Interestingly, Bobby Jindal and Rick Santorum, both also running for high office, support Carson's statement that Muslims should not be trusted in high office. So what's wrong with all of this, besides the US Constitution, which all of these individuals seem to disregard? First, we see here the common misconception that Muslims, Islam, and American identity are incompatible, right? Interestingly, there's a research study that was just released by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, which undermines this false assumption. It actually found that individuals who are more likely to say that their Muslim identity is important to them are also more likely to say that being American is an important part of their identity as well. So there's a positive relationship between the Muslim identity and the American identity for Muslims in America. And that undermines this false conception or assumption that Western democratic principles are fundamentally at odds with the Islamic faith tradition. Muslims in America, many of them, are reconciling these two identities. And that speaks to the underlying assumption in Carson's statement that Muslims should not be in high office. But one of the questions I had when I looked at these statements from Donald Trump, from Jindal, from Rick Santorum, from Ben Carson, that the wave of Islamophobia that occurred last September, I wondered why September? Why was it that in September we saw this flood of Islamophobia? And so I turned to the New York Times. And I checked out what was making headlines during the month of September. On September 3rd, top news, migrant crisis gives Germany familiar role in another European drama. On September 4th, quote, migrant chaos mounts while divided Europe stumbles for response. On September 5th, migrants cross Austria border from Hungary and, quote, exodus of Syrians highlights political failure of the West. September 6th, quote, Germans welcome migrants after long journey through Hungary and Austria. September 8th, migrants who survived shipwreck are grateful but disillusioned. September 9th, a new wave of migrants flees Iraq yearning for Europe. September 10th, EU nations urge to accept 160,000 migrants. September 12th, empathy in a German city transformed by refugees. September 13th, Eastern Bloc's resistance to refugees highlights Europe's cultural and political divisions. So it was the refugee crisis. And what we see is that a public discourse about what to do, what proper responses to adopt to the influx of Syrian refugees specifically, devolved into sheer Islamophobia. And that might help explain Rick Santorum's comments back on September 15th when he expresses this fear about the spread of Islam, as you recall. Because the influx of Syrian refugees, particularly in Europe, but also in the United States, triggered anxieties about the place of Muslims and Islam in Europe, as well as Western democratic societies, and about the quote-unquote invasion of Muslims or Islam in these societies. And that anxiety translated or turned into a generalized fear and suspicion that Muslims could not be trusted, that they're not like us, and that they can't be in charge of a country because they're different. Interestingly, in September, there were 10 incidents of violence against Muslims or Muslim organizations. They included a Muslim college student in California being murdered, as well as 2 young American Muslim men who were murdered in Florida. They included a Sikh American who was attacked while being called a terrorist. Sikhs are not Muslims, but they're often mistaken as being a Muslim. He suffered a fractured cheekbone, lacerations, and other physical injuries. It also included Muslims in Michigan who were spat at by protesters as they exited a public hearing because they wanted to build a new mosque in their neighborhood. It included Muslims in Florida who found a ceramic skull, wooden cross, and an American flag in front of the entrance to their mosque. So 10 doesn't seem like a lot, except if it's your son or your brother or your father or your husband or your uncle who's been hurt or even worse, killed, then it's too many. In the time that remains, I just want to address briefly the phenomenon of Trump violence. So last month, a new narrative emerged in the media, specifically about how violence surrounds the candidate. He has said publicly that he wants to punch a protester in the face. A Chicago rally was canceled because Trump supporters were involved in violent interactions with protesters. Protesters were hurt during a rally in Kansas City. Trump actually threatened Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders on Twitter. All of this happened last month. But the first known victim of Trump violence was actually on August 20th of last year. That's when two Trump supporters physically attacked a Latino homeless man. And when they were arrested by the police and asked about why they beat up this homeless man, they explained that they were inspired by Trump's statements on immigration, specifically his comments that Mexicans were rapists and criminals. And while the first full wave of Islamophobic rhetoric came in September, Islamophobic political rhetoric reached a fever pitch in November. On November 13th, the Paris attacks happened. And it was at that point that Trump came on the political scene and began espousing extreme and discriminatory statements about Muslims and Islam. They included that he would strongly consider shutting down mosques. During an interview with Yahoo News, he said that special IDs and databases for Muslims were a possibility, something he wouldn't rule out. He falsely claimed that he saw video footage of Muslims in New Jersey celebrating the terrorist attacks on 9/11. He criticized President Obama's belated mosque visit and suggested perhaps he feels more comfortable there. He told CNN's Anderson Cooper that, quote unquote, Islam hates us. During another media interview, he stated that at least 27% of Muslims are very militant. Again, we see so many different layers of Islamophobia in his comments. First, with respect to shutting down mosques, another finding made by the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding in their research released last month is that there's actually a positive relationship between those who attend mosques and their level of civic engagement. So Muslims who go to the mosque are more likely to be engaged civically. Oftentimes, mosques are misunderstood as places of radicalization, but research shows that in truth, individuals are more likely to be seduced by extremist rhetoric online than they are by sermons in their mosque. Another important observation to make about Trump's rhetoric is the role of media. Interestingly, most of the Islamophobic rhetoric that Trump has espoused has been in the public media spotlight. This is important because he's not only sharing his Islamophobic policy positions with supporters at a political event or rally, but he is permitted to disseminate and spread this Islamophobia throughout the country and even the world. In fact, research shows that while Mr. Trump has paid for only $10 million in advertising, he's actually received $1.9 billion worth of television coverage this presidential election season, more than any other presidential candidate and more than all the Republican candidates combined. That was November. There were 35 instances of violence against Muslims and Muslim organizations in the month of November. So hate crimes tripled. Of course, part of this is due to the terrorist attacks in Paris, but there is also a strong perception among Muslim community leaders and Muslim activists and advocates that the mainstreaming of Islamophobia by the political candidates also created fertile ground for these violent attacks. Causation is difficult to prove, except for in cases such as the homeless Latino man, where the attackers later confessed to local law enforcement officials that they were motivated and inspired by Trump's statements on immigration. Similarly, here is a picture of Osama. On March 12th, last month, Osama, together with a friend who didn't want to be identified, but who's not Muslim, but Latino, stopped at a quick check next to a university. They were refueling and picking up some snacks. They were hungry. And at that time, they were actually attacked. And their attacker, while beating them, said, "Trump will win. We will make America great again." He also yelled, "Trump, Trump, Trump." Causation. Now, something I didn't tell you about that. The perpetrators who assaulted the homeless man in California last August, those two perpetrators were actually brothers. And what I didn't tell you is they had been previously convicted for a hate crime against American Muslims. So what that incident tells you, and what this most recent incident tells you from last month, where an American Muslim was attacked, but so was his Latino non-Muslim friend, is that prejudice, discrimination, and bigotry is not a Muslim issue. It's a shared struggle by Muslim and Jew, by Latino, African Americans, and Indians, by the disabled and women, by all of us as Americans. Only together will we overcome it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie. Noreen Shaw is now here. Noreen is a prominent national security and human rights lawyer, frequent commentator and author of reports on surveillance, domestic counterterrorism investigations, and prosecutions, drone strikes, torture, and Guantanamo. That's a full basket. All happy news. She conducts advocacy with the White House, federal agencies, Congress, the UN, and regional human rights bodies. Her previous positions include as acting director of Columbia Law School's Human Rights Clinic and legislative counsel to the ACLU. Welcome.
Thank you so much for the invitation to come to this really important event. I think I haven't ever heard such a comprehensive review as that of the Islamophobic rhetoric that we've been hearing over the last several months, and it is certainly a wake-up call, one that I hope many people hear. I wish that this room was full of journalists because they are the newsmakers. They are providing earned media to public figures, and earned media meaning they don't have to pay for ads to spout Islamophobic rhetoric. They just have to say it, and it gets on the news. And so they need to also cover the other side of what's happening here. And I think you did such an amazing job in bringing us to a sense of what exactly is happening, what has been happening over the last several months. I should start by saying I'm speaking in my personal capacity. I work at Amnesty International at the US section. I'm speaking in my personal capacity Amnesty International is a nonpartisan organization and a 501c3 organization, and I am a nonpartisan individual. But I thought it was so important to come and talk with you all about the Islamophobic rhetoric we're seeing in this election cycle, because we all want to know why it's happening. We want to know what to do next, but we also want to know why. And I want to take a few steps backward from that amazing presentation about all the rhetoric we're seeing and think about, well, how did we get to this point? So I think we all know that we're living in a moment of crisis. A sense of crisis grips our nation. And that sense of crisis seems to escalate or ratchet up every time there is another major attack among Western people. It doesn't happen every time there's a major terrorist attack or an attack by an armed group in the Middle East or in parts of Africa, but it happens every time there's one in Europe. And that national sense of crisis is actually something that feels very poignant now, but it's existed over and over again since 9/11. So for many people in this room, if you're younger, if you're a college student, you're born into this national sense of crisis. The United States has been on a permanent war footing since the 9/11 attacks. And it has transformed the way that our entire counterterrorism bureaucracy is organized. It's propelled that bureaucracy. There's millions of dollars to be made thanks to this sense of crisis. It's also transformed life for American Muslims across the United States. And I can't hope to speak or pretend to speak for those diverse communities and individuals. But I think it's probably fair to say, and maybe I say this based on my personal experiences with my family, that many American Muslims are living in fear of tomorrow, a fear of what their grandchildren's America is going to look like, or a fear of what their own America will look like. For the first time, my parents and their friends are extremely worried about whether they're safe in this country. And they had that fear after 9/11 too, of course. But the fear is of a different quality now. It's a kind of sustained fear of tomorrow. It's a fear of internment, of being banned, of having assets seized. People are asking each other, do I need to move my money to another country? Do I need to plan to retire somewhere else? And we don't know, or people don't know, if the fallout from the Islamophobic rhetoric that we're hearing in the election, the fallout happens next year or next decade. But it's going to go somewhere, right? These people don't just go away. When people mobilize around hate and prejudice, it's not as though the election ends and then they go home and that's the end of that. The effects of this will be felt for a generation at least. And there are effects tremendously on people here in the United States who are American Muslim and everybody else as well, and I'll get into that. But I want to start by talking about how we came to this. And Angie, one of the moments, the pivotal moments of this election cycle that you pointed out was when a Trump supporter says to Donald Trump, are we going to get rid of them? And that's actually this interesting moment because it's not Trump who proposes to get rid of them. It's a Trump supporter who thinks that this is the time to ask the question. He gets the platform to ask it, and his voice gets amplified over and over again through the media, but it's him who's saying it. So why is a Trump supporter the one who says it? Why is he there saying it? It's because he's primed to do it. Islamophobia doesn't exist as an effect of the election. The election is a symptom of Islamophobia that is rooted deeply into America now. And we don't necessarily always recognize it, especially because under the last 8 years, President Obama has been in office. And the kind of ferocious anti-Muslim rhetoric that we see now, that wasn't coming from the administration. So it seems like it comes out of nowhere because you don't have an administration that's itself espousing that rhetoric, but it doesn't really, right? This individual, these people, these Trump supporters, they don't come out of nowhere. Have been interested. They've been wanting to say these things for a long time. And if we go back and look at the previous election cycles, people were saying things like this too. They just didn't get as good earned media coverage. So I mentioned that it's built into the system. And I want to take some time to talk about that, partly because it's here to stay and we need to understand why and where it comes from in order to tackle it. And partly because we need to know about all of its victims. The victims of Islamophobia are not just the people who are direct victims of hate crimes and harassment. They're also people who are impacted by US counterterrorism policies, from unlawful drone strikes to Guantanamo to torture to entrapment to surveillance. Islamophobia is about fear, and this fear is actually built into our counterterrorism system. Former FBI Assistant Director Thomas Fuentes appeared in a documentary, an HBO documentary called The Newburgh Sting. And one thing that he said in that documentary that I think was really striking was he was explaining how he goes before Congress, or how he used to go before Congress, and how they explained the threat of terrorism. And he said, if you're submitting budget proposals for a law enforcement agency, for an intelligence agency, you're not going to submit the proposal that says we won the war on terror and everything's great. Because the first thing that's going to happen is your budget is going to be cut in half. It's the opposite of Jesse Jackson's keep hope alive. It's keep fear alive. So there is a bureaucracy that's built up after 9/11 around the threat of counterterrorism. And it's not about investigating terrorist attacks, which the FBI is traditionally pretty good at. It's about getting left of boom. It's about finding the place before the attack happens and putting not just the FBI, but an entire federal machinery into place to predict terrorism costs a lot of money. And it becomes a self-sustaining project. And every intelligence agency's budget grows around this project of preventing and predicting terrorism. We don't want to just prevent the imminent attack. We want to prevent anybody who's even going to think about planning for that attack. And when you start to get farther and farther left of boom, and you start to try to find the threats before they emerge, you go towards trying to find the suspects. And where are the suspects located in this kind of imagination? The suspects are located in the Muslim community. Despite everything Angie told us about the lack of correlation between mainstream American Muslim communities and actual threats, that is where the threat is located. And that threat that's located for the intelligence and defense establishment in Muslim communities is also then reified and amplified in media depictions. And so I'd like to think about this fear machine as really a publishing company. And they're publishing books about Muslims, metaphorically speaking. The kind of youth thriller genre. Muslims embody the fear of terrorism. Muslims are the zombies, the vampires, and the monsters of terrorism. That's the publishing house. Story after story is written about Muslims, where essentially, in effect, Muslims are playing the part of the zombies, the vampires, and the monsters. The zombie part is that there's just more and more Muslims, that Muslims everywhere are emerging as these threats, that everywhere you look, ordinary Muslims are trying to join ISIS, they're trying to travel overseas. People who don't even seem like they're Muslim, they're converts, are also trying to travel overseas to join ISIS. They're vampires. In a lot of fictional depictions of Islam and Muslims, Muslims are people who seem normal, seem assimilated, but then the next thing you know, they turn around and they radicalize. And they radicalize and they turn into something that we didn't expect. They were so enticing, they seemed so great, but they deep down were still Muslim. And Muslims are also treated as the monster. The monstrous actions of ISIS, which has committed atrocities, mass killings, sexual slavery, torture, indisputable atrocities by that armed group and by other armed groups. Those are attributed to the mass of Muslims. And so we all become monsters, and we are associated with that monstrosity. And that is the fiction of the American Muslim that exists in media that we hear over and over again. They are the zombies, the vampires, and the monsters. So you mentioned, Angie, September 2015. September 2nd, 2015 is when the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi, the refugee, is found dead on the shores of Europe, and his photo is taken, and it goes viral. And he breaks through this fiction. He cannot be considered a monster. He is just a lifeless body, a very pitiful body. And it's that moment that unleashes, strangely, this tide of anti-Muslim hate, because at the same time that the world had this outpouring of sympathy for him and for other refugees like him, there has to be a reaction, and that reaction is more and more Islamophobia. So Islam is in relative obscurity before 9/11 in the United States. but now the Muslim identity is racialized. There's this fiction of it. And we hear about the Muslim world a lot, and it almost sounds like a kind of new world, going to the Muslim world, like you set off on a journey, you get in a boat, maybe you make it to this Muslim world. It's this one place, and we're all one kind of people, even if we live in the United States. Mustafa Bayoumi, in his book, it's a new book, This Muslim American Life, says that we're living in a war on terror culture, and in this war on terror culture, Muslims are collectively responsible and sympathetic for all acts of violence by individual Muslims everywhere, unless they explicitly say otherwise. And even then, their words are doubted. Islam is always and forever a foreign and foreigners' faith in the United States. And he points out the symptoms of this war on terror culture, as he calls it. Mosques and Islamic schools under construction are considered threats. Muslim college students are treated as inherently suspect. We know that, for instance, the NYPD placed informants in local Muslim student associations for what appear to be fishing expeditions, and even created a special force, the demographics unit, to monitor Muslims for signs of radicalization, seemingly without any particularized suspicion. And this has had a huge effect on how American Muslims identify themselves as part of the fabric of America. As Jean Theo Harris wrote in an article in The Intercept last month, the effect of surveillance on her students has been profound. She said they describe feeling constantly suspected by many Americans and by law enforcement. Their sense of security, to feel safe on campus or in their mosque, to build community, to engage in politics, has been compromised. Many students stopped being active in their Muslim Students Association out of fear of surveillance. And Muslim women are especially affected by this. As Sahar Aziz, a law professor, noted in 2012, the Muslim headscarf now marks women as representatives of the suspicious, representatives of the inherently violent and forever foreign terrorist other in our midst. And so they, of course, in some ways appear to be especially susceptible to this violence. So what are the broader impacts? We know that this has had a huge impact on American Muslims here. I mentioned it has also had a huge impact on Muslims everywhere. In the war on terror culture, all attacks on the United States are assimilated into a single threat, the Muslim threat. So the 9/11 attacks are made into the same thing as the 1979 embassy takeover in Iran. And that's made into the same thing as the Brussels attacks, even though those are completely separate groups. And we see this play out in the rhetoric of US officials who want to do things like keep Guantanamo open. So Senator Tom Cotton spoke last year in the Senate. I was sitting in the hearing room. He talked about how Islamic terrorists, that's the word that he and many others are using, Islamic terrorists don't need the excuse to attack the United States. They attack us for who we are. And he rehearses this litany of attacks from the 1979 embassy bombing to 9/11 to more recent attacks. And he concludes, in my opinion, the only problem with Guantanamo Bay is there are too many empty beds and cells there right now. We should be sending more terrorists there for further interrogation to keep this country safe. As far as I'm concerned, every last one of them can rot in hell, but as long as they don't do that, they can rot in Guantanamo Bay. And yesterday, Senator Tom Cotton, introduced a bill to keep Guantanamo open forever. There are 89 people who remain held there indefinitely, likely until they die, without charge, most of them, and without trial in a fair court system. The specter of Muslims, all Muslims as a threat, is what haunts Guantanamo. It doesn't matter who you are, if you're there, you are a terrorist because, in some sense, you are a brown man and you are a Muslim. It's not limited to the people who are at Guantanamo. I mentioned the HBO documentary, The Newburgh Sting. The Newburgh Sting is a case where an FBI informant encourages a man who is bigoted, a guy named James Cromedy, to turn his talk into action. The informant offers James Cromedy $250,000 to commit a terrorist attack, and Cromedy shows hesitation for months. After Cromedy loses his job at Walmart, Cromedy comes back to the informant. The informant designs a plot. He directs Cromedy to recruit 3 other men. The government, as the Second Circuit Court of Appeals put it, came up with the crime, provided the means, and removed all relevant obstacles. So in this sting operation, as a result of it, James Cromedy and other men are serving 25 years in prison. And what are the effects of these many terrorism cases that we're hearing about, these great sting operations? David Hellbrunner, the director of that HBO documentary, told me, they are creating these terrorist situations and then saying, look at all these busts we're making. So the implication is that there must be terrorists out there more than ever, and it makes people scared. And it makes John Q. Public think that Muslims and terrorism go hand in hand because he sees these two concepts linked repeatedly in the press, Muslims and terrorism. So the machinery of counterterrorism that treats Muslim communities as potential threats, treats them as hotbeds of extremism, means that we have surveillance programs that seek to map Muslim communities. We have new programs called Countering Violent Extremism that take signs of teenager behavior, like acting listless, having a sense of futility, feeling lonely, and ask teachers and social workers to monitor students, monitor American Muslim teens for signs that based on their moodiness, they might become terrorists. So we don't have a lot of time, and I think there's much more that we could say. But the question I want to leave you with, and I hope that we can talk about, is what do we do now that we understand how deeply ingrained, I hope, have a little bit more understanding of how deeply ingrained Islamophobia is in our society, that it didn't just come out of the woodwork with the election, it existed for a long time. It was part of and reflected in a lot of our counterterrorism policies. And no matter who wins the election, it's going to remain part of that system, those institutions, those counterterrorism and intelligence operations. What we can do is actually mobilize human rights supporters in the United States. All of the issues that we've been talking about today, it's not just about prejudice and bigotry in the abstract, it's people's lives that are at stake. And if we can mobilize not just American Muslim communities to be more politically involved, which many organizations are trying to do, which I think is great, but we make anti-Muslim hate and this hysteria and this fear-mongering part of the mainstream human rights movement, something that is on the agenda of every major human rights organization, we can start to get back some of those percentage points that you hear about in those polls. We ought to have 30% of people in this country feel strongly about prohibiting torture, closing Guantanamo, not having Muslims be banned, which seems like a small kind of ask. We ought to have at least 30% of people. One would hope that we would have 2/3, but I don't think we're going to get there. But if we have 30% of the US population that is ready to mobilize in the first 100 days of the next administration to say no to a national security agenda that tries to villainize a set of people based on their national origin and their religion, then we can push back, and I think we can succeed no matter who is elected. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Finally, Ishan Dapoor, Foreign Affairs reporter for the Washington Post, where he helms World Views, the newspaper's international affairs blog, and reports on a range of global issues, including conflicts in the Middle East. Prior to that, he served as senior editor and writer in Time magazine for 8 years, posted both in New York and Times Asia headquarters in Hong Kong, and he is a graduate of Yale University, where George W. Bush also graduated from. There you go.
Well, many others as well. Thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Esposito. Thank you, NG. Thank you, Noreen. It's great to be on a panel with you guys. I know we're very short on time, so I'll be as brief as possible. And I would love to get some sort of conversation going as well, if there is time for that. So I'll be quick. Today, as Dr. Esposito said, I'm a foreign affairs reporter at the Washington Post. I help run our international affairs blog called World Views, where I write on a whole range of sort of major themes in the international conversation. Obviously, a lot of it in the past half year has been around the refugee crisis, around the U.S. political cycle as well. And so today, we published an essay I wrote on looking at some of the aspects of the tenor of the American political conversation on Islam, particularly among the GOP candidates, as well as its parallels in parts of Europe. I thought it was a rather fair, balanced conversation where I work through some of the rhetoric and also point to what the argument of a clash of civilizations can obscure when thinking about the security crises in Europe and elsewhere. Let me just read out to you some of my Twitter notifications today. And as it is, I'm a blogger, I'm very much a creature of the internet, so this is my daily existence. Let's see. Islam is a disease. Islam is the root of all evil. Islam is soulless and backward. Islam is a religion of shit, #exterminate Islam. I don't really have to go very far to prove that Islamophobia exists. I just look at my phone. And this has been a daily occurrence for me as someone who is quite visible on social media and is quite outspoken about certain issues. You see this backlash anyway. If you look at the comment sections on all sorts of stories in the Washington Post, you'll see the same thing as well. It's clear to me that no matter how you view these things, the questions of Islamophobia, about the validity of certain talking points in the GOP election cycle, it's clear that the current American political conversation has brought out something that we haven't really seen in the mainstream for a long time. We can have a debate about whether it's the media's fault in some way, but I don't really want to get into that. I think there's much more else to talk. There's a lot of other stuff to talk about. Ingi laid out a really very convincing chronology of the past year, and Noreen really got into the psychology of what we're looking at. As I'm a foreign affairs writer, I'm not, on the national or political desks of the Post. I don't feel like I can comment on the inner workings of the campaigns, but I can sort of point to the ways in which the conversation here can be refracted in an international context. And I think in the current mood, the current sort of mood of anti-Muslim sentiment and discourse that we're seeing, I think is built out of three distinct but interlocking trends that I'd like to itemize for you. The first, I think, is the emergence of, and perhaps even crystallization of, a kind of European far-right populism in the American political conversation, in American politics. We can call it the Trump effect, we can call it white nativism or nationalism, but it's something that's really come to the fore in a way that is profound. And it to the point that it's created an existential crisis for the Republican Party itself. The kind of inelegant metaphor that I like to draw is the GOP for quite a few years now has been a party both of Marine Le Pen's National Front, that is the far-right party in France, as well as Sarkozy's more moderate or center-right Républicain or sort of center-right party. This election has pitted the American National Front against the American Sarkozy faction to all sorts of chaos. Now, what is this populism? It mirrors the European populism in many ways. A sense of alienation with urban elites, a sense of frustration at with the economy, with unemployment, with a sense of loss of identity, a sense of being irrelevant to the national mainstream. The target, first, as Angie pointed out, were Mexicans. Muslims very quickly became part of this alien enemy other. And it's led to all sorts of fascinating conversations in foreign policy. What I think is interesting is the extent to which the conversations in the GOP political race have been so uninformed. You have a political debate where one candidate is talking about just taking all the oil and not really presenting very much else. You have another debate where a candidate talks about carpet bombing parts of the Middle East. These are non-starters for serious people in the policy world in DC. Forget about anybody else who has any sober understanding of the crises and political issues of the Middle East. The second point, obviously, as Ingi also mentioned, is the impact of the refugee crisis or migrant crisis facing Europe. Now, let's be clear what this crisis actually is. It's first and foremost a crisis in the Middle East. It's not a crisis in Europe. It's a crisis for the countries surrounding Syria. It's a crisis for Syria itself, where the vast humanitarian burden of what's been an epochal war is still being felt. Now, there's been obviously a massive influx, an unprecedented influx in many decades into Europe, and that's triggered, let's say, another sort of existential moment for the continent. It's whipped up across the board all sorts of nationalist populism from Eastern and Central Europe, where you're seeing a really interesting, I mean that in a very neutral term, type of right-wing nationalism take root in countries like Hungary and Poland, these countries, and Slovakia and elsewhere, where they were so vehemently opposed to even the idea of taking Syrian refugees in the hundreds, forget about thousands. And it's threatened, Europe's most powerful leader, Angela Merkel. It's fitted into the ongoing chat about Britain's exit from the European Union. It's threatened the idea even of Europe's open borders. Now, this is all stuff we have to think about and take into account when we think about the fears and animus of the current moment. The scenes that we saw in Cologne, the really unfortunate scenes on New Year's Eve in Cologne and some other northern European cities that fed into so much of the anti-Muslim, anti-refugee hysteria in Europe thereafter, were a disaster for Muslims. I'm talking about incidents where a number, the numbers are unclear, but quite a few young men of Arab and North African extraction were involved in kind of organized, semi-organized acts of violence on New Year's Eve that involved all sorts of harassment and theft and other crimes. That was a disaster for Muslims and also a disaster for the idea of Europe in many ways. It's really stoked a lot of opposition in various governments, and it's something that played a role in the present conversation. The third thing to think about, obviously, is the effect of the attacks in Paris and Brussels. They were cynically exploited here in many ways in the GOP election. Immediately after Paris, the conversation here suddenly turned to the threat that Syrian refugees pose to the United States, despite the fact that the US does have one of the most laborious, protracted vetting processes around, one that until the events in Paris, people were talking about is too slow, we need to speed it up in some way. All of a sudden, the conversation was completely dialed back to, we can't even take any Syrian refugees. So they was very cynically exploited here. But in Europe, there are perhaps more real concerns about the return of radicalized jihadis from Syria, about questions of alienation and radicalization within certain communities in Europe. And I think those also bear consideration when we think about what's fueling the perception of Muslims elsewhere. I say this as somebody who is not Muslim. I'm from a secular Hindu family, and so I have no particular stake in sort of celebrating religious identity over any other or of any other kind of identity. But I think what's really been borne out in the last half a year is the extent to which Muslims and the threat of Islamist violence has become a kind of stalking horse for all sorts of political movements, and a very convenient stalking horse for all sorts of political movements. There was a report yesterday from Freedom House, which is a think tank here in DC, that focused on what it perceives to be an erosion of democratic liberal values in countries in the post-Soviet world. And it singled out the rise of Islamophobia in Europe as a real problem. The author of the report said and pointed out to the way that, the quote here is, claiming that Europe faces a Muslim invasion has become standard fare for a range of politicians and political parties in Europe. This kind of speech undermines democracy by rejecting one of its fundamental principles, equality before the law. There is a danger that this kind of hateful, paranoid speech will lead to violence against minorities and refugees. So I think while we do have to think about what is fueling this hateful, paranoid speech as critically as possible and with as much of an open mind as possible, I say that as a journalist, I think there are also other ways of contextualizing it. What I found particularly useful as a reporter for the Washington Post was a story I did last year around September or November, I forget exactly when, that quite surprisingly to me became the most read story on the Washington Post news site, or one of the most read stories in 2015. I had found a bunch of surveys conducted in the late 1930s of American attitudes towards Jewish migration and the taking in of refugees from Europe at the time. And these are polls that showed vast majorities of Americans opposed to this kind of assistance to refugees, opposed to repatriating German Jews or taking in German Jews. Even a survey that found Americans opposed to taking children fleeing Europe as the Nazi regime ascended. And what was incredible was just very simply spelling out what these surveys said, presenting it in the context of the current conversation on Syrian refugees in the wake of the Paris attacks, and to see, I mean, how quickly this really struck a nerve in the conversation. I went on all sorts of TV shows about it. I was on NPR and CNN and other places. Not CNN. Scratch that part. I know we're on the record here. And what I found most heartwarming was I was inundated with letters from senior American Jews living in this country who each shared with me the stories of their family and relatives coming over in the wake of World War II. Each one of them had stories of relatives who had been turned away by the visa regime, who had been on the MS St. Louis, the ship full of refugees Jews that was turned away from Cuba because the US wouldn't take them in. And each saying, we can't let this ever happen again. And it was an incredibly moving thing for me to get these letters, to feel the sense that, you know, people see the connections, see the present moment. This is a time when, in the 1930s, when people really saw the Jews as this kind of alien fifth column, this subversive threat, this community that lived, that potentially posed a kind of ideological threat. And that's a very similar echo to now. So to have this connection, to feel its emotive power was something I thought was very affirming, and hopefully a more positive note to leave you with as we go on.